my own PhD was focused on my practice in an organisation called Wessex Community Assets. And Wessex Community Assets, over the last 20 years, has been involved in many aspects of the community economy, but the particular area that I wanted to focus on was around community housing. How do organisations kind of go from a sort of a more fluid sense of exploring possibilities to something more fixed? The form becomes fixed. And within that, oftentimes the organisation becomes kind of more professionalised, and we become reliant on experts. And I felt that what was happening in my organisation was that the experts that we worked with as consultants were kind of closing down possibilities to say this is the way that community housing should be done. And so that was my kind of initial question, but soon I sort of thought, we can't just identify experts as the problem, and how do we deal with that? Because any complicated process, and housing is a very complicated process, will always involve professionals. So the issue is more, what are we trying to do together? What is our objective, I suppose?
Tim, we both had our moment of fame in Sao Paulo, receiving, being granted Fellowship Researcher for Schumacher Society. Could we go back to your earliest memory of wanting, realizing, becoming aware that you wanted to do the research on the topic that you did?
I guess the beginning was that I was teaching economics at Schumacher College, and I had been working for some time with Patricia Shaw. That when Patricia then said, "Would you like to do a PhD?" I didn't immediately run away. My initial motivation was to think, here I am teaching and supervising people doing masters, but I need to deepen my understanding of the research process. And so I decided that doing a PhD would be a good way to do that. Well, I think research has to be a very personal thing. It can't be something that you're doing for someone else or because you want a book out of it or a PhD. There has to be something in you that draws you to that research. So, and it's always this funny combination of maybe a concern or a disquiet, and then, over time, maybe that gets translated into a question. But that question might just be, should we try something? And in that trying, I think the trying to do something must be something that feels good for you. I mean, it sounds a bit trite, but that is kind of true to what you're interested in, what you're drawn to, what makes you feel, interested. Because research is also learning, and learning must be something that we want to do, that we're drawn to do. So I think this interesting combination of concern, questions, learning about something we are drawn to, that for me is what research is about. A kind of key element of the research with others is around this issue of the sustainability of housing. That the materials we use are cement, concrete, bricks, steel, glass, these materials that have a very high embodied carbon. And also the main house builders in the UK, they're building houses that will need to be retrofitted in 10 years' time because they're such poor quality. So there is a kind of policy issue. There's the practical issue of, being able to show the impact of what we're doing currently. That's a kind of theoretical aspect that maybe will shift policy. But I think our experience over the last 7 years has been that unless you really engage with these alternative materials, timber, wood fibre board or hemp-based insulation, etc., etc. Unless you really get a feel for those, everything stays, abstractly in the mind. And I think the shift is slower. So I believe that if people can become familiar in this way, that a phenomenological approach makes us familiar with these materials, then I believe the shift is more likely to happen. And obviously we then hit up against lots of barriers, regulatory barriers, myths about certain materials or whatever, but still I believe we have to keep going with that. And then we have to weave that in to all these other things that we have to attend to as well within what, as I said, is a very complicated terrain. So in my research, there were two ways that I was working. So one way was kind of participatory action research. It was to draw together people from organizations, individuals who are interested, farmers, into a kind of research collective. And we, over a period of 3 or 4 years, we did lots of practical things. We ran workshops making benches. We ran workshops making tiny houses. We ran workshops creating a corner of a house as a kind of model, one-to-one, which we then filled with, for example, timber cassettes filled with hemp and clay. So this was a very practical exploration of what are the possibilities, but also what are the constraints when you try to introduce these processes of practical fabrication and the use of materials. And the other dimension, which I think also links closely to the work of the research and action community, was a sort of phenomenological approach to these materials. For example, this amazing plant that in the field is glowing green and has this smell and sways in the wind. People were really affected by engaging with this material, and I sense, although I wasn't being explicit with my colleagues in this more participatory action research mode about the phenomenological dimension, it clearly was affecting people in this way. And I think the third stage, which I kind of feel I'm still in, which is, okay, so we've shifted the organization, I'm shifting as a practitioner, we're doing these more practical things, but still they're at the level of kind of prototyping. And so the third stage was then to say, okay, how does this then translate into actually trying to develop community housing initiative? But at least we've been able to shift the conversation a bit. So for example, in Bridport, I think the Housing Association, ideally they'd just like to knock it down, go to a factory that makes these modules and then put all these modules together like Lego, and that's it. But people in the community don't want that. So how do we have these conversations? We had commissioned really interesting architects to come up with our own proposals based on what the community wanted. So now we are in this dialogue, but at least we're having the dialogue. So the work has kind of allowed that to happen.